So the festival calendar continues, and we find ourselves on the week of Pesach, the week of Passover, also as is typical Holy Week. And so my plan had always been to basically take out one of my Passover reflections. I have a handful of reflections on Passover, and I was going to go over that for our video this year. And those can wait because those will always be there. But this year I've been captivated by a new reflection and meditation that I wanted to share. And I've been reading this book. It was recently given to me. It's a book called Breaking Ground, Charting Our Future in a Pandemic Year. It's put out by Comment Magazine, basically collected a whole group of contributors. And then it's a collection of essays on all kinds of things, from politics to social justice to theology, to just all sorts of things. And the whole thing has just captivated me. I'm challenged every day that I read about 4 of these essays a day right now, and I'm being so challenged and provoked to think critically. It's got conservative thinkers and liberal thinkers, not in argument or debate, all talking about the same thing, but talking about it from these different perspectives. And it's unbelievably refreshing and interesting to read. There was an essay in here about Exodus, and it's just captivated it will serve as my meditation this year for Passover, even as I think about that meal with my family. And so I wanted to share that essay here for our Festival Edition video. And it's an essay written by Catherine Boyle. She is a venture capitalist who lives in San Francisco. And she wrote an essay titled Exodus, The Ironies and Finalities of Being on Top of the World. She begins by quoting Isaiah 43, which says this: "Remember not the former things, nor consider the things of old. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." Isaiah 43:18 through 19. Here's Catherine's essay. "On the day the sun didn't rise in San Francisco, the early warning signs came through the screen. The 6:30 a.m. Zoom always required unnatural light, making the outlines of faces fuzzy. The natural morning light, combined with the touch up my appearance feature on 2020's preferred video conferencing system, hides the marks of age and sleeplessness that most of us seek to mask. But by 9 o'clock, the fluorescent light was still dominating the screen, and the darkness outside our windows had turned to infernal orange. The scientific explanation for our sunless day in September is pretty dull. Clouds of soot from the largest California wildfire in history intermixed with the Bay Area's perennial fog, turning the usual sepia hue of dirty global cities into an apocalyptic blood orange sky. Though Twitter blamed the hellscape on far more menacing forces, the direct cause of our Blade Runner day was mostly carbon clinging to the blue light hues while letting the red pierce through. If we were more like ancient peoples, many people joked, we would assume the gods were enraged. We'd be running for the hills to escape their wrath, or at least head straight for our prepper bunkers. That we are unlike ancient peoples is actually the only myth, as this is exactly the exodus that's happening in Silicon Valley right now, and will continue for the next few years as true believers deliver themselves from this promised land. It's time to build, yes, but it's also time to leave. The battle over tech supremacy has been waged, and all of our premonitions came true. We wanted flying cars, and we got vertical takeoff innovation hubs from every car maker in America. Software has not only eaten the world, but feasted on your screen-weary eyes, as swallowed your children, your church, your bank, and your politics, and somehow it all feels inevitable. That these feats of human progress, of instant connectivity in a now homebound world, became the scapegoat of our time is another symptom of the era's end, cueing the quiet exodus of builders who have bigger aspirations than the same-day shipping that keeps our households afloat. Now Silicon Valley is witnessing a reckoning, but it's not the long-awaited one predicted by the New York press or the antitrust bonanza that Washington longs for because too many people seem satisfied getting their news from Facebook. The reckoning is more of a realization that tech exceeded expectations and somehow squandered the fruit of its own garden, that and that the city on a hill that could have supported so much innovation was not Florence in the Renaissance, nor the Athenian Academy with MacBooks. Rather, it became a government-sponsored needle exchange, a haven for the homeless and forgotten that put government's paralysis on display downtown on Market Street. San Francisco had 4 times as many deaths from overdose this year as it did from the COVID-19 virus. 2020 is not the great reckoning predicted in the book of Revelation. Despite the fires, the plagues, the wailing on Twitter, it is the resignation and determination of Exodus, of a dogged people packing up U-Hauls and fleeing this frontier state to seek a newer, more eternal world. The revolution of the late 20th century has yet to be named as an epoch, but we can assume that nomenclature will begin in the coming years, alongside of the battle for what it all really meant. What we now call our technological age was supposed to be a full-throated and enduring argument for the future, not unlike previous epochs in history that pushed art, science, philosophy, and religion forward in dizzying ways that run counter to ordinary time. The Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the French Revolution. These movements now sit as categories on our bookshelves with clear beginnings and ends, and more importantly, clear hubs and cities of frenetic building that drove the ethos forward. Many books assume that contemporary critics or philosophers were blissfully ignorant of the unraveling of their revolutions. But we should not assume that contemporaries did not feel the same twilight setting. The figurative orange skies always creep in before dawn. Which brings us to the supposed death of Silicon Valley, a fate that's long been predicted, but with data now finally catching up. San Francisco apartment rents in 2020 have deflated by 20% after an up and away decade that made the city truly unlivable. Home inventory has reached a 15-year high in a city blighted by restrictive housing policy that makes construction cranes as miraculous as stumbling upon a burning bush. The growth in outline sales tax collection, according to the San Francisco Chronicle, is the lowest of all counties in the state of California, and public tech companies such as Pinterest paid upward of $90 million to break their leases in downtown San Francisco. Some would argue this is a clear end to the Bay Area tech dominance, while others would point to the many new unicorns that popped up this year despite the once-in-a-century pandemic. No one's living here, yet somehow the companies are still growing. Silicon Valley doesn't have the cultural critics to weigh in on whether this era is officially over, but we do have venture capitalists, and our Nostradamuses are telling us that change is afoot. Do we really need this office? The founders have all left. Their entire partnership is now living in Montana. It's only a 2-hour flight away. Denver seems like a good option, but Reno has no state income tax. The weirdness of this exodus is that it's not driven by fear. Technologists weren't really driven out by a plague, a fire, or San Francisco's insatiable need for higher tax revenue. Those ills were always apparent, and yet people stayed to carry the torch. The exodus of tech's true believers may be that the covenant is finally fulfilled. That when America, along with the rest of the world, met its darkest hour and turned inward, that technology that was long ridiculed as frivolous or dangerous led us to relative normalcy. The Zooms, the Tiger Kings, the Signal chats, the Slack jokes, an election news cycle that plowed ruthlessly forward on Twitter. Though inconvenient, mothers and fathers set their children in front of screens to occupy them for just long enough to survive a terrible year. And maybe, just maybe, the same-day shipping racket that made Jeff Bezos the richest man alive is actually a feat of human genius that held the country together when public infrastructure and social fabric were fraying at the seams. Perhaps our lowly software revolution was actually the fruition of a long-held California dream, when the physical world forced us inside and virtual life prevailed. For that triumph, the nerds can now smell the impending scapegoating of their success. And like so many of history's prophets and heretics, those who believe most fervently in the promise of technology are beginning their long march away from the valley. And they will substitute the virtual world for the physical space that once defined this movement. Silicon Valley is no longer a place, they'll say. It's a way of being, of building, and the latest embodiment of belief in human progress. And it's spreading faster than the viruses and the wildfires and the apocalyptic threats that mire our physical world. Silicon Valley is over. The Exodus is just beginning. And this essay has captivated me because of its ability to invite me to ask a set of questions about the exodus that I'm in the middle of in this pandemic year. What are the things that I'm learning? What are the things that I'm taking with me? And what are the exodus? What is the exodus? What is the Egypt that I'm leaving behind? And part of this essay is that I find so captivating is the way that Catherine circles all the way back around by the end of the essay. And I'm not sure if the very thing that we were critiquing at the beginning is the very thing that might even be our saving grace. It was an interesting turn at the end of the essay. But one of the pieces that I reflect on is more towards the beginning. I'll read it a second time. If we were more like ancient peoples, many joked, we would assume the gods were enraged. We'd be running for the hills to escape their wrath, or at least head straight for our prepper bunkers. That we are unlike ancient people is actually the only myth, as this is exactly the exodus that's happening in the Silicon Valley right now, and will continue for the next few years as true believers deliver themselves from this promised land. It's time to build, yes, but it's also time to leave. What are the things that I am learning? What are the things that I have learned? It's time to leave. And yes, it's time to build, but Passover is about Exodus. So what are the things that I have learned it's time to leave from? The battle over tech supremacy has been waged, and all of our premonitions came true. We wanted flying cars and got virtual takeoff innovation hubs from every car maker in America. Software has not only eaten the world, but feasted on your screen-weary eyes. It has swallowed your children, your church, your bank, and your politics, and somehow it all feels inevitable. That these feats of human progress, of instant connectivity in a now homebound world, became the scapegoat of our time as another symptom of the era's end, cueing the quiet exodus of builders who had bigger aspirations than the same-day shipping that kept our households afloat. To think critically about the way idolatry takes shape in my life, and to also think critically about how some of those same things are also unbelievably beautiful blessings. To spend time discerning that. I know that many of us have talked about that in the middle of this pandemic, and I know that so many of us we're exhausted. We're exhausted. How can I think critically? You're asking me to put, I'm just trying to survive. And I hear that. And I affirm that. But when we are afforded the opportunities, like we'll be afforded around the Passover table this week, to have discussions about Exodus, are we taking the opportunities to reflect, to continue to take inventory? I know we did it last year. I know it was in vogue to sit at home and take inventory of what's important and to go through the art of elimination and to strip away some of that stuff. And so many of us have done that. We've done that. And yet here we sit with another opportunity to say, did we make it out of Egypt? Are we still out of Egypt? And how can I use the things that I've learned in the middle of this desert wilderness to continue to prepare for whatever is next? And just like the people in the Exodus story, in the Passover story, they didn't know what the future held. They didn't know that it would be 40 more years in the wilderness. They were on their way out of Egypt. They were making a stop at Mount Sinai. They were on their way to a promised land. In the same way, we may not know what lies ahead of us or what the next chapter is. But we'll miss a great opportunity if we just continue to sleep on the opportunities that we are afforded. Let's not miss our Passover moments. Let's not miss History does not bring us to these kind of moments where we get to have some really important conversations, and the world actually facilitates those kinds of transitions. I don't know what that might be. What are you trying to say, Marty? I don't know. I don't even know what that means for my family yet. But I'm going to enjoy ruminating on that as we think about Passover, as we think about the pandemic and what we're leaving, what we're coming out of, and where we're headed, what we're headed into. So I know that's going to drive my conversation this year. So I share that. Don't know if that hits you the same way it hits me. Probably should be a no-brainer. Maybe all of you are having those conversations and you're like, well, no, duh, Marty. But for me, that essay provoked a conversation I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I share it with you for this year's Passover reflection. If it's helpful, beautiful. If it's not, we'll see you for the next video as we talk about what would be next. Probably Shavuot coming up in a few weeks. But until then, we'll have some more teachings on the kingdom, and I'll look forward to having those conversations.